9. Lagad Bunker. From the outside and even the inside, there's nothing unusual looking about the Lagad Rehabilitation Center in northern Latvia. However, there's a massive Soviet-era bunker hidden just 30 feet beneath the building, with enough room to support 250 people for up to 3 months. Construction on the bunker, dubbed Pensionat, began in the late 1960s and was finished in 1982. It was the designated place for Soviet leaders in Latvia to go in the event of a nuclear attack. The clandestine complex consists of 90 rooms, including a central meeting room with a statue of Lenin serving as its centerpiece. There's also a radio studio, so that officials in the bunker can communicate and broadcast messages to the outside world, in addition to offices, a canteen, and of course, sleeping accommodations. To this day, it still contains its original furniture, decor, appliances, and practical everyday items like eating utensils and dining ware. The bunker was equipped with its own sewage system, electricity, water reservoir, and treatment facility, as well as an oxygen and climate control system. Outside the structure at ground level, there are 2 helipads disguised as a swimming pool and a basketball court. While the bunker was well built for the most part, its planners fell short in several ways. It lacked a place to store bodies in the unfortunate event that someone staying in the bunker passed away, and its roof wasn't thick enough to withstand a nearby nuclear blast. Thankfully, the emergency shelter was never needed. The site is open to visitors, and those who book their tour in advance get the opportunity to eat an authentic Soviet meal prepared inside the bunker's canteen. 8. Pyramiden. In 1910, Swedish nationals founded a settlement high above the Arctic Circle in the Svalbard archipelago. The Soviets bought the remote village of Pyramiden and its surrounding territory in 1927, and mined the island's nearby coal deposits for the next 70 years. At its peak, Pyramiden consisted of over 1,000 inhabitants, mostly mining workers and their families. The settlement grew to include a cultural center, a theater, a library, art and music studios, a school, a 24-hour canteen, and a sports complex containing the world's northernmost swimming pool. Many planned communities throughout the USSR were abandoned when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s. However, Pyramiden continued to operate until 1998, when sudden orders were handed down to close up shop and leave. During its time as a mining settlement, as much as 10 million tons of coal were extracted from the landscape. All the residents were gone within a few months, leaving Pyramiden completely abandoned. When the first visitors returned nearly 10 years later, they found the buildings and their contents in pretty much the same condition as they'd left them. This was due to the deserted town's remoteness and the frigid climate, which left much of the site frozen in time. Experts estimate that what's left of Pyramiden could survive for at least another 500 years thanks to the extreme Arctic climate, which means that it may outlive many modern human settlements. Today, the Svalbard archipelago belongs to Norway, and the settlement is seeing a revival of sorts. Since 2012, a few dozen have returned to Pyramiden, including around 30 workers who maintain the site and provide tours to visitors. 7. MS Azerbaijan. The cruise ship MS Azerbaijan was built in Finland in 1975 for the Soviet Union. However, she had several names throughout her lifetime, including the Arcadia, the Island Holiday, and finally the MS Enchanted Capri. In 1998, the 515-foot vessel began the final leg of its career, offering 2- and 5-day cruises out of New Orleans. As a smaller cruise ship, it only had 248 cabins, but it came with a plethora of amenities, including restaurants, bars, swimming pools, gift shops, a theater, a disco, a gym, a beauty salon, and a hospital. But the Enchanted Capri's biggest claim to fame was its onboard casino, which consisted of slots and various table games. Unfortunately, the company that chartered the ship was struggling, and in 2001, Commodore Cruise Line went bankrupt. Shortly thereafter, the International Transport Workers Federation (ITWF) arrested the ship in New Orleans on behalf of its crew, who were owed more than $500,000 in back wages and were essentially trapped on the vessel. In the biggest repatriation operation ever carried out by the ITWF, over 230 workers from 40 countries were sent home. The ship belonged to a Mexican company from 2003 until 2020, when it was slated for demolition. However, before the Enchanted Capri could be scrapped, it lost its anchor during a storm and ran aground on a beach in the city of Alvarado. Ever since, it sat abandoned along the shoreline as a ghost ship, with no clear plans for the future. 6. Plogstein Missile Base. After the US began building underground missile bases in the 1950s, the Soviet Union followed suit. In 1960, the USSR built one of its first underground bases in Lithuania, which at the time was a constituent republic of the Soviet Union called the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. Located in a remote forest near the village of Plogskia, the Plogstein base housed medium-range missiles. Its construction costs amounted to roughly the equivalent of billions of dollars in today's currency. Around 10,000 soldiers moved into the area to complete the top-secret project, which they somehow managed to do without revealing the nature of their work to the local population. Surrounded by an electric fence, the site consisted of a network of tunnels and 4 deep shafts. The structures were covered by concrete domes that moved on rails and took about a half hour to open. Thankfully, no missiles were ever launched from the property. The base was shut down just 12 years after it began operating, by which point its existence had been discovered by US intelligence. It was abandoned for good when the Soviet Union collapsed, and one of the 4 silos on the base currently operates as a Cold War museum. 5. Senkerali Svabaja. Between 1949 and 1989, Hungary was governed by the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party, which operated under the sphere of Soviet influence. During the 1960s, the Soviet built a military base near the city of Veszprém. It was known as Senkerali Svabaja, and it consisted of both military infrastructure and civilian accommodations. There was housing for Soviet soldiers and their families, as well as restaurants, pubs, theaters, schools, and more. The settlement was largely self-sufficient and isolated from conventional Hungarian cities. Its residents tended to stay within the town, and outsiders weren't allowed in. Anyone who didn't live there most likely had no idea what the base looked like or what they did there on a daily basis. As the Soviet Union inched towards its inevitable collapse during the late 1980s, steps were taken to demobilize the military presence at Senkerali Svabaja. Residents began to leave, and by 2004 the settlement was completely emptied out. Its buildings are heavily damaged and looted, and its streets are cracked and overgrown. The hangars that once housed aircraft look more like decaying greenhouses, and all that's left inside the apartments are abandoned personal belongings that nobody's found valuable enough to take. However, the crumbling ghost town remains a popular attraction among urban explorers who don't go there to steal, but to gain a first-hand look at what life during the bygone Soviet era was like for some people. Would you ever visit an abandoned city in Russia? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. 4. Communist resorts. During the Cold War, Poland was a Soviet satellite state, meaning that while the relationship between the countries was unofficial, Poland was under Soviet control. Eastern Bloc leaders believed that average working people deserved vacations, but on their terms. Like many other aspects of life in communist Europe, the government decided that it knew which types of recreational facilities were best for its people. Starting in the late 1950s, state-funded holiday resorts were built throughout Poland to facilitate workers' right to rest. These one-size-fits-all facilities were abruptly abandoned during the late 1980s as the Iron Curtain began to fall throughout Eastern Europe, and they've been neglected ever since. Urban explorer and photographer Marcin Wojciak travels across Poland snapping photos of these defunct, overgrown resorts. In order to preserve their memory, he shares the haunting images on Instagram under the username Kozmoderna. Many of the retreats are in prime locations that are typically protected from development nowadays, such as on lakesides, by the mountains, and next to the sea. Wojciak told the First News that it would be really difficult to obtain permission to build in places like this today, and that their locations alone speak to how Poland used to be a completely different world with different values. Included among his photos are images of a moss-covered swimming pool and a vintage bowling alley, both of which would have been considered luxuries at the time they were being used. There are also patterned mosaics with political overtones, artwork depicting Smurfs, and other happy cartoon characters. A stage and a left-behind foosball table give an idea of some of the activities and entertainment that the resort's working-class visitors enjoyed. The resorts are full of big windows as well, many of them offering ample views of the nature that now surrounds the buildings. 3. Transnistria. Shortly before and during the collapse of the Soviet Union, a number of informal breakaway states formed throughout its prior territories. In 1990, a region calling itself the Pridnestrovian Moldavian Republic better known as Transnistria, refused to join the newly formed country of Moldova and fought for its independence. The conflict lasted for 2 years, resulting in over 1,000 deaths. Then in 1992, a ceasefire agreement between Transnistria and Moldova was established. However, it was never officially resolved, and to this day the breakaway state remains demilitarized yet heavily fortified. Located on a thin strip of land between the Ukrainian border and the Dniester River, Transnistria has a population of around 2.3 million people, and about 140,000 residents inhabit their capital city of Tiraspol. Most countries recognize the territory as a part of Moldova under Russian occupation. And while its people speak mainly Russian, it has its own president, flag, anthem, and currency known as rubla. Transnistria celebrates its Independence Day on September 2nd with heavily militarized displays that bear an eerie resemblance to a North Korean parade. Communist symbolism remains prevalent in this widely unrecognized separatist enclave, which features a hammer and sickle on its flag. Its confusing status of being frozen in a decades-long ceasefire and the heavy Russian military presence pose an uncertain future for Transnistria, especially as the war in Ukraine continues. 2. Born Solennoo. The town of Born Solennoo in northwestern Poland dates back to the 16th century, when just a handful of people lived in the area. In 1933, the Germans bought the community's land and forced the residents to move elsewhere. They then destroyed their houses and built 2 military bases, as well as their own settlement in place of the village. Throughout the Second World War, they used the site as a prisoner of war camp. After World War II ended, Poland became a Soviet satellite state, and the Red Army took over the base. Born Solennoo soon became one of Poland's largest Soviet military camps, yet it remained completely hidden for more than 50 years. During that time, it didn't exist on any maps, and with good reason. It was being used as a top-secret storage facility for nuclear weapons. The base's existence finally became public knowledge when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Red Army reached an agreement with the Polish government for its withdrawal from the region. After the last of the Soviet forces left, Born Solennoo once again became a civilian town in 1992. It's remained open to the public ever since. Most of the first residents to move there were Polish repatriates who'd been forcibly resettled in Siberia and Kazakhstan more than 50 years earlier. An estimated 5,000 people live in Born Solennoo today, but the town remains littered with disused Soviet-era buildings that were never repurposed and are now falling apart. There's also a decommissioned silo, a Soviet T-34 tank, and a missile storage facility that now operates as a Cold War museum. 1. Chisinau Circus. When the Chisinau Circus was built in 1981, Moldova was part of the USSR and was called the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic. For 23 years, crowds flocked to the building for entertainment, which included performing animals, trapeze artists, clowns, and all the other displays of a traditional circus. Built in a brutalist architectural style, the imposing structure featured a 40-foot ring and had enough seating for 1,900 guests. Circuses were a big part of Soviet culture, so much so that even after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and a major economic crisis hit Moldova, the Chisinau Circus's doors remained open. During its first years of independence, the country faced skyrocketing inflation rates and a costly war with its neighboring breakaway state Transnistria. This plunged Moldova into economic freefall and earned it the distinction of Europe's poorest country. Still, the circus continued. In 2004, it closed its doors temporarily for repairs but failed to reopen as planned. The building sat neglected for years as it fell into disrepair, with no clear answers on what its future held. Renovations finally began in 2014 as part of a public-private partnership, and in 2022, the Chisinau Circus put on a show for the first time in nearly 20 years.
9. The long-lost Island of Gold. Starting as far back as the 7th century, a wealthy and powerful port city called Srivijaya controlled trade along the Straits of Malacca, which functioned as a vital commercial link between the east and the west. Located on a small island, the thriving ancient metropolis was ruled by a succession of powerful kings until 1025 AD, when India's Chola dynasty broke the city's power. Trading continued at Srivijaya for the next 2 centuries, but the city's influence and culture gradually declined and eventually slipped into obscurity. obscurity. There are almost no remaining traces of Srivijaya today, but possible signs of it have started to turn up in surprising numbers in recent years. While no archaeological excavations have been carried out, divers have recovered dozens of artifacts from Indonesia's Musi River. These finds include figurines, temple bells, tools, and ceramics. They've also found coins, jewelry, wine jugs, musical instruments, sword hilts, and many other items. Many of these relics are made from gold and precious gems, suggesting that the area was once defined by vast wealth. The discoveries strongly suggest that the lost city has been found, but the artifacts are being sold on the global antiquities market and they're disappearing fast. Without any official scientific exploration, it's impossible to know for sure whether the objects were left behind by the people of Srivijaya or if they belong to another unknown culture that is yet to be identified and studied. Understanding that time is of the essence, scientists are finally making an effort to study the area. They have little physical evidence to go on when it comes to the city's known physical remnants, other than some brick temples and inscriptions. Being able to examine some artifacts in depth would give experts an unprecedented opportunity to learn about the society that once ruled the region. 8. Mysterious shipwreck. In early 2020, Polish archaeologists announced the discovery of a large, centuries-old shipwreck at the bottom of the Vistula River near the city of Warsaw. Measuring 121 feet long and nearly 20 feet wide, the ship could date as far back as the 14th century, when Poland was Western Europe's primary grain supplier. The archaeologists who found the ship believe it was a river-faring type of cargo vessel called a punt, and that it may have been capable of transporting up to 100 tons of grain and other goods at a time. The team discovered the otherwise undetectable wreck in the river's muddy water using sonar. Because visibility is so limited, they were unable to identify any artifacts related to the punt, including the cargo it may have been carrying. But according to archaeologist Artur Brzozowska, any goods that the vessel took to its watery grave are likely long gone anyway. Artur told Polish press agency PAP that he wasn't counting on finding much in the wreckage, even if the team managed to get a closer look at the boat. They took some samples of its wood to determine the mysterious wreck's exact age in hopes of gleaning some rudimentary details about its history, but unfortunately, nothing else has been released about the ship. 7. A mammoth femur. As regular divers in southwestern Florida's Peace River, Derek Demeter and Henry Sadler were used to finding fossils of extinct animals, teeth and bone fragments belonging to prehistoric creatures. However, they were shocked to find an intact 4-foot-long leg bone from a mammoth in 2021. The pair uncovered the ancient femur or thigh bone from beneath a layer of sand on the riverbed. While the age of the bone is unclear, it's possible that it belonged to a Columbian mammoth, a hybrid species that commonly wandered as far south as Costa Rica during the last ice age. DNA research suggests that the Columbian mammoth was a hybrid between the woolly mammoth and an undiscovered lineage that made its way from Siberia to North America around 1.5 million years ago. Based on the femur's measurements, the mammoth it belonged to may have stood 14 feet tall, and it likely weighed as much as 22,000 pounds. And while Demeter and Sadler have donated numerous artifacts to the Florida Museum of Natural History, Sadler decided to keep the leg bone in his classroom at the middle school where he teaches. In other words, it was just too cool to part with, but he also wanted to use it to engage his students in lessons about Florida's ancient history. 6. Tamar River Ship Graveyard. An estimated 1,000 shipwrecks litter the waters around the Australian island of Tasmania. At least 14 of them can be found in the Tamar River in the state's northern region in an area that's simply known as the burial ground. The vessels were deliberately sunk in a line between the 1920s and the 1970s in an effort to create more flow in the river, which is notorious for silting up. This was just one of numerous projects that the Australian government poured millions of dollars into as part of its efforts to resolve the problem. The Tamar has been called the river that flows upside down by the locals. The so-called burial ground consists of mostly wooden vessels, including a 3-masted sailing ship called the Zelatur. They were burned to the waterline, and then they were sunk in hopes that they would force the river's current to divert eastward. Whether or not the project was a success remains a topic of debate to this day. Either way, the ship's effectiveness as barriers wasn't expected to last forever. Eventually, the hulls rusted away and the wood collapsed. Then, the river's current overpowered what's left of the vessels, which represent just a fraction of the estimated 115 wrecks that were discarded throughout Tasmania's waterways between the early 19th century and the late 20th century. 5. Confederate warship. In 2013, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began raising a long-forgotten Civil War-era ship from the Savannah River, where the Confederate military deliberately scuttled it to prevent from falling into Northern hands. Known as the CSS Georgia, the 250-foot-long wooden vessel was built in 1862 with funding from a group of merchants' wives known as the Ladies' Gunboat Society. These women collected donations from benefactors throughout the South. Despite its solid financial backing, the ship failed to serve its intended purpose. Its steam engines were too weak to power it through the Savannah River's strong tidal waters, so the Confederate Navy parked it upstream and used it as a floating battery for defending the city against Union forces. When Confederate leaders learned that the Union troops were advancing toward the city under General William T. Sherman in 1864, they sank the CSS Georgia. The wreck was rediscovered in 1968. By the time salvaging efforts began 45 years later, much of the ship was destroyed. Crews nevertheless raised some fascinating artifacts from the recovery, including 4 cannons, more than 130 unexploded cannonballs, some engine parts, an intact propeller, and siding. They pulled what's left of the ship from the river in 10,000-pound sections, measuring roughly 4 by 24 feet. Experts are studying the retrieved portions of the Georgia to learn more about Confederate shipbuilding practices, which involved different techniques than the more industrialized North. If you discovered the remains of a creature in a river that had never before been seen by science, what would you call it? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. 4. Gargantuan goldfish. If you had a somewhat typical American childhood, there's a slight chance that you won a goldfish at your local fair at some point and wound up flushing it down the toilet, or at least you knew someone who did. And it's possible that the fish was still alive when it was sucked into the plumbing and forgotten about. You may be surprised to learn that a lot of flushed goldfish survive their trip down the tubes and wind up living, sometimes even thriving, in whatever local body of water they end up in. In 2019, an employee from the nonprofit Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper discovered a 14-inch goldfish in the Niagara River in upstate New York. The fish, however, may not have been flushed down someone's toilet. It was most likely discarded or released by a human as an unwanted pet or to escape from a fisher's bait bucket. While goldfish that are confined to aquariums typically only grow to 1 to 2 inches long, those that are released into the wild often reach lengths of 12 to 14 inches, and in some cases they grow even longer. Goldfish are native to Asia and are considered invasive when they make their way into the environment in North America. They reproduce rapidly and are capable of surviving year-round in and around the Great Lakes. And in large enough numbers, they have the potential to disrupt or even wreak havoc on local wildlife. Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper estimates that there are currently tens of millions of goldfish living throughout the Great Lakes. In a Facebook post, the organization encouraged anyone with a goldfish they don't want or can't take care of to return it to the pet store, find a new owner, or do whatever else they can to avoid flushing it or releasing it into the wild. 3. Centuries-old cargo ship. While carrying a shipment of lime near the mouth of Germany's River Trave around 400 years ago, a cargo ship ran aground on a shoal and was quickly buried in a layer of fine mud. It remained forgotten about until 2020, when authorities spotted it during a routine sonar survey of the region. Measuring somewhere between 66 and 82 feet long, the vessel may have been a single-masted cargo ship called a galliot. Its identity is a mystery, but it was most likely one of the countless 17th century vessels that frequently traveled along the River Trave. During the Hanseatic period between the 13th century to the middle of the 15th century, the guilds and towns of northern Germany made up a successful bloc known as the Hanse, or the Hanseatic League. At the time, the Hanse dominated the continent's trading industry throughout the North and Baltic Seas. Very few ships from the Hanseatic period have survived into modern times. Most have been destroyed by the elements and eaten away by shipworms, a fate that recently discovered cargo vessels managed to escape. The mud it was buried in protected it from both the forces of nature and the destruction of shipworms, leaving it remarkably well preserved. Divers found around 150 wooden barrels filled with quicklime, which was used in construction. According to maritime archaeologist Fritz Jurgens, the lime would have come from somewhere in Scandinavia, most likely from central Sweden or northern Denmark. The cargo was on its way to Lübeck in northern Germany, where it would have been in high demand due to the area's lack of natural limestone resources. researchers uncovered a letter from the wreckage that was written in 1680. It contained a request for some cargo to be recovered from a ship that had run aground in the river. They believe the message is referencing the recently discovered ship, which was built with trees that were felled during the 1650s. In the near future, they're planning to raise the wreck in hopes of maintaining its astonishingly intact state and to prevent any danger to modern shipping in the region. 2. A monster sturgeon. While conducting a sturgeon survey in Michigan's Detroit River in 2021, a group of biologists reeled in a massive female sturgeon thought to be more than 100 years old. It took 3 team members to haul in the 7-foot-long, 240-pound creature, which they later described as a real-life river monster. The Fish and Wildlife Service described it as one of the largest lake sturgeons ever caught in the U.S. Even the scientists who captured the gargantuan fish were shocked by its size, which they later said was at least twice as large as any fish previously caught in the area. After measuring and tagging it, they released it back into the river. Perhaps even more surprising than its size is the fact that the sturgeon managed to evade detection by scientific surveys for more than 20 years before its discovery. This could be because sturgeons tend to spend most of their time near the bottoms of the rivers and lakes they live in, feeding on small fish and other bottom-dwelling prey. The species is considered threatened in nearly all 20 of the states it's found in due to numerous factors. These include pollution, dams, and other man-made structures that prevent fish from accessing its spawning grounds, and past commercial fishing that saw the sturgeon killed off in droves. To find a specimen as large as the one the researchers caught in 2021 was incredibly unlikely, even as the local population's numbers become increasingly healthy through conservation efforts. Number 1. Aons Mississippi River barge. In late 2022, a middle schooler from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, named Aaron Benkaz stumbled upon what seemed like an old shipwreck on a sandbar while walking his dog along the Mississippi River. He was thrilled to tell his friends at school and was shocked when they didn't believe him. Aaron figured that if his peers were skeptical, his teachers would definitely think he was making the story up, so he didn't tell them. But the word got around to adults and caught the attention of local archaeologists, who visited the site and confirmed that the young man was telling the truth. The wreck was officially dubbed Aaron's Shipwreck, but the wooden vessel is in poor shape. State archaeologist Chip McGimsey told The Advocate that it's unclear what kind of boat it is, but that it may have been a barge. McGimsey speculated that it was built sometime after 1880 and that it likely measured roughly 50 feet long and 20 feet wide. But until more research is carried out, nobody can state any facts with any certainty. Aaron discovered the mysterious wreck at a time when the Mississippi River's water levels were lower than usual. Much of the wreck remained underwater, so McGimsey made plans to return to the site at a later time when water levels were projected to decrease even more. Which of these river discoveries shocked you the most?
8. K152 Nerpa accident. The Russian Navy was carrying out sea trials in the Sea of Japan on a fleet of nuclear-powered attack submarines in 2008 when a faulty sensor triggered the fire extinguishing system inside one of the vessels known as K152 Nerpa. As a result of the malfunction, a poisonous fire suppressant was released into the cabin. 20 sailors died from inhaling the oxygen-depleted gas. Sadly, some of these deaths were caused by defective portable breathing gear. Another 21 crew members were seriously injured. In the initial aftermath of the disaster, nobody seemed to know what set off the emergency system or what caused so many things to go fatally wrong, including Russian officials. Following an investigation, authorities charged Captain Dmitry Lavrentiev and engineer Dmitry Grobov with death by negligence. They claimed that Grobov accidentally activated the emergency system and that Lavrentiev improperly trained the crew. In response to the allegations, the men argued that the submarine's equipment was faulty. They were acquitted in 2012, but the verdict was overturned. There was a retrial the following year, and they were once again found innocent and cleared of any wrongdoing. The accident was Russia's worst submarine disaster since 8 years earlier in 2000, when 118 people died in what's known as the Kursk nuclear submarine disaster. K152 Nerpa was repaired, and in 2011, it was leased to India for 10 years and renamed INS Chakra. But the vessel continued to encounter mechanical issues. In 2017, it was involved in another accident and underwent $20 million in repairs. 3 years later, in 2020, a high-pressure air cylinder reportedly exploded inside the submarine, killing a crew member and causing extensive damage to the weapons system, hydroacoustic equipment, and the hulls. The Indian Navy returned the Chakra to Russia ahead of the lease expiration date due to increasingly unreliable power plant and maintenance issues. 7. HMS Urge. Built for the British Royal Navy during the early 1940s, the 191-foot-long, 58.2 meters HMS Urge achieved its first World War II victory with the sinking of the Italian tanker Franco Martelli in the Bay of Biscay. From there, the U-class submarine proceeded to the Mediterranean Sea, where it torpedoed the Italian merchant ships Aquitania and Marigola. A few months later, in December 1941, the Urge torpedoed the Italian battleship Vittorio Veneto. The vessel also made history as one of the first submarines to land commandos by canoe and logged numerous successful commando raids. However, despite its achievements, the Urge experienced its fair share of problems throughout its career. Its torpedoes were sometimes detected by enemy forces, became jammed, or otherwise failed to hit their targets or detonate. On at least one occasion, a technical failure caused the torpedo to do a U-turn. The weapon narrowly avoided the submarine, sparing its crew from potentially catastrophic consequences. In April 1942, the Urge left Malta for Alexandria, Egypt. But it never reached its destination, and while the military concluded that the vessel must have sank, nobody knew exactly what happened to it until relatively recently. The wreck was finally located in 2019 off the Maltese coast, where it came to rest 400 feet, 122 meters, below the water's surface after being struck by a mine. A team of researchers from the University of Malta made the discovery as part of an ongoing effort to map the seafloor throughout the region. They began seeking out the Urge specifically after being contacted by Francis Dickinson, whose grandfather was the submarine's commander. During the vessel's nearly 80-year disappearance, there was widespread speculation about where it had ended up. In 2015, Belgian historian Jean-Pierre Misson claimed to have found the Urge off the Libyan coast, far from its planned course. But ongoing conflicts with the country prevented experts from looking further into it, and we now know that Misson's suspicions were incorrect. 6. USS Grayback. Out of the 52 American submarines that were reported missing throughout World War II, at least a handful of them have been found as part of an initiative called the Lost 52 Project. In 2019, the organization marked its 7th discovery of a lost submarine, the USS Grayback. Built in 1940, the Grayback was based out of Fremantle in Western Australia and spent most of its wartime career patrolling throughout the southern and western Pacific regions. It sank 14 ships and menaced and disrupted many more, proving itself to be an invaluable asset to the Allied war effort and one of the conflict's most successful submarines. During its 10th patrol in 1944, the Grayback's crew relayed that they only had 2 torpedoes left. They were ordered to head back to home base, but all communication soon stopped, and the submarine disappeared. Word soon spread that it had been destroyed by enemy aircraft. According to Japanese records, the vessel was hit by a 500-pound, 227-kilogram aerial bomb. It exploded and sank immediately. A little while later, a heavy oil slick was visible on the water's surface, confirming that the Grayback was destroyed. The Lost 52 project located the submarine roughly 58 miles, 93 kilometers off the Okinawa coast, at a depth of 1,427 feet, 435 meters. They were able to find it after discovering an error in the previous calculation of its whereabouts, which was off by about 100 miles, 161 kilometers. Finally, after spending 75 years without answers, the surviving family members of the Grayback's crew received long-awaited closure. 5. Kursk disaster. During a training exercise in the Barents Sea in the year 2000, Captain Gennady Petrovich Lyachin ordered the crew of a nuclear submarine that he was commanding to fire 2 torpedoes. It was Russia's first major naval exercise in over a decade, and it would unfortunately turn out to be one of its deadliest of all time. The submarine, known as the Kursk, had a reputation for being unsinkable, but it proved otherwise that day when a faulty torpedo casing caused a hydrogen peroxide leak. A fire broke out and 2 large explosions ensued, sending the submarine to the bottom of the sea. The Russian government initially reported that all 118 crew members perished before the Kursk reached its resting place. But a handwritten note found in Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov's uniform pocket explained that 23 sailors survived the 2 explosions. They languished for several hours, desperately looking for more oxygen, which caused another fire to break out, and helplessly awaiting rescue that never came. In the tragedy's aftermath, the Russian Navy was widely criticized for claiming that there were no initial survivors and for not doing enough to try saving them. A top-secret investigation concluded that the military was ill-prepared for the disaster, and that its response was unjustifiably delayed. The report cited stunning breaches of discipline, shoddy, obsolete, and poorly maintained equipment, as well as negligence, incompetence, and mismanagement. Despite the damning findings, no charges were ever filed against any personnel or crew members. Russian prosecutor General Vladimir Ustinov blamed the accident on a technical failure and concluded that it was impossible to place blame on specific individuals. He absolved the defective torpedo's manufacturer of any blame and said that the entire crew died within 8 hours, which he claimed wasn't enough time to rescue any survivors. Many disagreed with his findings, including retired Navy Captain Vladimir Mityayev, who lost a son on the Kursk and described the disaster as a clear case of negligence. But any demands for justice ultimately fell on deaf ears, and the Russian government considers the matter a closed case. Would you ever explore the ocean in a submarine? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 4. USS Argonaut. Construction on the U.S. Navy submarine USS Argonaut began during the late 1920s. As one of the 9 V-boats that were produced during the interwar period, the 358-foot-long, 109 meters vessel went down in history as one of the largest non-nuclear submarines ever built. Shortly before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in late 1941, the Argonaut began patrolling throughout the North Pacific. Its dehumidifiers malfunctioned, causing electrical fires to break out and crew members to become sick with fevers. After undergoing a major overhaul in early 1942, the sub was converted to a troop transport submarine and sent to the South Pacific. After dropping troops off at Makin Island for an Allied raid on Japanese forces, the Argonaut returned to its base, Pearl Harbor, then proceeded to its new base of operations in Brisbane, Australia. While patrolling off Papua New Guinea in early 1943, the vessel attacked a convoy of Japanese firefighters and their destroyer escorts. The destroyers swiftly counterattacked, and a depth charge severely damaged the Argonaut. In the meantime, the destroyers continued to pump shells into the submarine until it disappeared beneath the water's surface, taking all 102 crew members with it to the seafloor. The disaster went down in history as the worst submarine-related loss of American lives during wartime. Shortly before the Argonaut's final patrol, the crew donated its bell. Nearly 2 years after the sinking, it was placed in the steeple of the newly built Submarine Memorial Chapel at Pearl Harbor, where it remains today and is still used in services. 3. USS Thresher. Named after the Thresher shark, the USS Thresher was a nuclear-powered attack submarine that met a catastrophic end, despite never seeing combat. Built for the U.S. Navy during the late 1950s and early 60s, it was designed to find and destroy Soviet submarines. The 279-foot-long, 85 meters vessel was the fastest and quietest submarine of its time. It also had the most advanced weapons system, including state-of-the-art sonar that was capable of detecting enemy submarines from an unprecedented distance. The Thresher underwent extensive sea trials in the Caribbean Sea and elsewhere throughout the Western Atlantic starting in 1961. 2 years later, the vessel left from Kittery, Maine to carry out dive trials roughly 220 miles, 354 kilometers off Cape Cod. It performed well during its initial descent halfway to its 1,300-foot, 396 meters test depth, where it remained overnight. During the submarine's deep dive trial the next morning, it stopped every 100 feet, 30 meters, to check the integrity of its operating systems. As the Thresher approached its test depth, communications with the nearby submarine rescue ship Skylark quickly became garbled and then dropped entirely. The Skylark's sonar soon showed the Thresher breaking apart as it sank to the ocean floor. It was the first nuclear submarine to be lost at sea. All 129 crew members died, making it the second deadliest submarine disaster on record. An investigation found that a leak in an engine room joint triggered the failure of critical electrical systems, rendering the subsurfacing equipment inoperable. Following the disaster, the Navy implemented major changes in its safety protocols through the establishment of a new quality assurance program called SubSafe. If anything good came of the tragedy, it was the rigorous standards that were put in place to prevent a similar disaster from ever happening again. 2. USS Scorpion. While the Cold War never erupted into direct combat between the US and the Soviet Union, both countries worked diligently to monitor the other amid mounting fears that the tensions between them could result in nuclear warfare. One way they did this was by conducting submarine surveillance and developing nuclear submarines, which were quieter and stealthier than their diesel-powered predecessors. Built during the late 1950s, the USS Scorpion served under the U.S. Navy, also known by its official designation SSN 589. It departed from Norfolk, Virginia in 1968 with 99 crew members aboard for a 3-month Soviet reconnaissance mission in the Mediterranean. At the end of its deployment, the submarine left the waters off Spain and began heading back toward the U.S., but it failed to arrive as scheduled, and the vessel's disappearance quickly escalated into a major military crisis. Navy personnel located the wrecked Scorpion off the Portuguese coast near the Azores 5 months after it was due to return to Norfolk. No official cause for the disaster was ever determined. 1968 was an eventful year when it came to mysteriously vanishing submarines. In addition to the Scorpion, 3 other subs disappeared under unexplained circumstances, including the Israeli INS Dakar, the French Minerve, and the Soviet submarine K129. While some believe that the Scorpion's disappearance resulted from a violent US-Soviet encounter, the evidence suggests that structural damage or an accidental explosion could have been responsible for the wreck. 1. USS Phoenix. During the Cold War, the U.S. built new submarines to catch up with the Soviet Union's rapidly advancing nuclear technology. One of those submarines was the Los Angeles-class attack submarine USS Phoenix. Built during the 1970s, the $700 million vessel operated out of Norfolk, Virginia. The Phoenix underwent numerous important deployments and exercises throughout its 17-year service career, including anti-submarine warfare operations, oceanographic surveys, and Soviet surveillance. Over a 203-day period in 1983, the vessel completed a record-setting 65,000-mile, 105,000-kilometer circumnavigation of the globe. It was decommissioned in 1998 when all its nuclear fuel was spent. To save money, the Navy opted to put the Phoenix into storage rather than replace the fuel. Over the following years, retired Navy Captain Peter Lumiansky led years-long effort to preserve parts of the sub and return them to its namesake city in Arizona as a testament to the silent service of Cold War submarines. In 2016, the sail, diving planes, and rudder arrived at the Papago Park Military Reservation for storage, where they'll remain until enough money is raised to restore them and build a monument. What's left of the Phoenix will eventually be on display at Steele Indian School Park in Phoenix. For now, the parts are sitting in a quiet lot, where members of the public with a valid ID are welcome to come and view them. Thanks for watching. Which one of these submarine disasters shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.